The head of the International Energy Agency, the organization that was created to protect the world from exactly this type of crisis, went on a podcast 3 weeks ago and said something that should have stopped every American in their tracks. He said that the Iran war has caused the loss of 12 million barrels per day of oil from the global market. And then he said this: when you look at the 1973 and 1979 oil crises, in both of them we lost about 5 million barrels per day of oil. These oil crises led to global recession in many countries. Today, we lost 12 million barrels per day, more than 2 of these oil crises put together. The head of the IEA just told the world that the current oil supply disruption is larger than 2 of the most devastating energy crises of the 20th century combined. The 1973 crisis caused gas lines that stretched for miles, triggered a global recession, and fundamentally restructured the American economy. The 1979 crisis destroyed the presidency of Jimmy Carter, sent inflation to 14.8%, and forced the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates to 20%. And the man in charge of monitoring the global energy supply just told you that what is happening right now is bigger than both of those events combined. And the national average price of gasoline has already climbed to $4.12 per gallon, according to AAA. Diesel has hit $5.62 per gallon, up 49% since the conflict began on February 28th. West Texas Intermediate crude reached $115.48 per barrel on April 6th. Brent crude topped $118 at the end of March, the biggest monthly price gain since records began in the 1980s. A ceasefire was announced on April 8th, but as of today, ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remains far below pre-war levels. The ceasefire did not reopen the strait, the oil is not flowing, and no American is ready for what is coming next. Because the lag between crude oil prices and the prices Americans pay at the pump, at the grocery store, at the diesel station, and on their utility bills has not fully arrived, it is on its way. And the IEA head warned that April will be much worse than March because the cargo ships that were already in transit before the war started have now all been delivered. There is nothing left in the pipeline, and the prices Americans are seeing today are based on oil that was purchased and shipped before the full impact of the Hormuz closure was priced in. And Bloomberg reported that U.S. government officials and Wall Street analysts are now considering the prospect that oil prices could surge to an unprecedented $200 per barrel if the strait remains closed through the year. $200, a number never reached in the history of the oil market, now being modeled as a plausible scenario by the same analysts whose projections move trillions of dollars in institutional capital. The Strait of Hormuz is the most important choke point on Earth, and Iran closed it in a week. 20% of the world's oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That single waterway, only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. It is the only maritime route available to the world's largest oil exporters: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran itself all depend on the strait for their energy exports. Before the war began on February 28th, more than 100 vessels transited the strait daily, carrying crude oil, refined products, liquefied natural gas, and liquefied petroleum gas. On March 4th, Iran closed the strait. Within a week, approximately 200 ships were stranded in the region, according to the New York Times. Oil production from Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE collectively dropped by 6.7 million barrels per day by March 10th and by at least 10 million barrels per day by March 12th. Not because those countries stopped pumping, because they had nowhere to send the oil. Gulf Arab producers ran out of storage capacity and were forced to shut in production because the strait was blocked and the oil could not leave. Qatar declared force majeure on all LNG exports. Saudi Arabia's largest refinery was targeted by drone attacks. Qatar's export facilities were hit. More than 80 energy facilities across the Gulf region have been damaged since the conflict began, according to the IEA, and more than a third of those facilities were severely damaged. The IEA estimates it could take up to 2 years to restore output from the Middle East to where it was before the war began. 2 years. That means even if the strait reopens tomorrow, the physical damage to wells, refineries, terminals, and pipelines will prevent a full recovery of Gulf oil production until 2028. Some fields that rely on secondary or enhanced oil recovery methods may never return to pre-war production levels because uninterrupted supplies of gas, power, steam, and chemicals are required to maintain those recovery techniques, and those supply chains were broken by the war. Southern Iraqi production dropped more than 70%. The Zubair oil field in Basra, which produced around 400,000 barrels per day before the war, saw output drop to roughly 250,000 as a result of continuous attacks. And Iraq derives 90% of its GDP from oil exports. The economic devastation across the Gulf is total, but the consequences do not stay in the Gulf. They travel through the oil market, through the shipping lanes, through the refining system, and into the price of every gallon of gasoline, every gallon of diesel, every grocery delivery, and every utility bill in the United States. And the disruption extends far beyond oil. 75% of the oil and 59% of the LNG that passes through the strait normally goes to Asian countries. China, India, Japan, and South Korea account for 70% of the oil. When those countries cannot get Gulf oil, they turn to the same alternative markets that the United States relies on, including West Africa, Brazil, Canada, and the North Sea. That competition for non-Gulf oil drives up prices on every barrel everywhere in the world, regardless of whether it ever went through Hormuz. The Philippines, which imports 98% of its oil from the Middle East, declared a state of national energy emergency on March 24th. The first country in the world to do so. Pakistan told cricket fans to watch games from home to preserve fuel. India raised export duties on diesel and aviation fuel to keep domestic supplies from leaving the country. Thailand saw diesel prices jump from 29.94 baht per liter to over 50 baht in just 5 weeks. Australia, which holds only 29 to 36 days of fuel reserves, released a large proportion of those reserves to support retailers in regional areas. And these global responses are not separate from the American experience. They are the competition. Every barrel of non-Gulf oil that India or China or Japan or Australia secures is a barrel that is not available to American refineries at a price Americans can afford. The global oil market is one market. And when 20% of its supply disappears overnight, every buyer in that market is competing for the remaining 80%. And the United States, despite being the world's largest producer, is also one of the world's largest consumers and cannot satisfy its own refinery needs with domestic production alone. What the federal government did and why the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute said the playbook is bare. The Trump administration moved quickly to try to contain the price shock. In early March, the president ordered the Department of Energy to release 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That release was part of a coordinated effort by more than 30 IEA member nations to inject 400 million barrels into the global market, the largest coordinated strategic reserve release in the history of the IEA. Trump waived the Jones Act for 60 days, allowing foreign-flagged vessels to ship oil and gas between American ports to reduce transportation bottlenecks. He authorized the sale of higher-ethanol gasoline blends that are normally prohibited during summer months due to smog concerns, hoping to stretch the gasoline supply. And the administration temporarily lifted sanctions on Russian and Iranian oil that was stranded at sea in floating storage, making it available to a broader pool of buyers. Every lever the federal government has to contain a fuel price crisis was pulled within the first 3 weeks of the war, and none of it was enough. Mike Sommers, the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, said in an interview that the playbook is pretty bare at this point. The playbook is bare. The head of the oil industry's largest trade organization just told you that the United States government has exhausted its toolkit for managing this crisis. The SPR release of 172 million barrels will take approximately 120 days to fully deliver, but the daily drawdown rate is limited by physical infrastructure. The SPR was already at its lowest level since 1984 before this release was ordered. After the 172 million barrel drawdown, the reserve will be further depleted at a time when the IEA head has warned that the crisis may worsen before it improves. Energy Secretary Chris Wright told CNBC that the administration has plans to bring additional diesel to the marketplace, but offered no specifics on timeline or volume. Meanwhile, almost half of the respondents to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas quarterly energy survey said higher prices would lead them to drill more wells. But as we have discussed in previous videos on this channel, new shale wells take months to drill and complete. And the production they add will not offset a 12 million barrel per day global shortfall. The math is simple and devastating. The world lost 12 million barrels per day. The IEA released 400 million barrels total. That is 33 days of coverage for the lost production. If the strait does not reopen in 33 days, the strategic reserves are consumed and there is no backup plan behind them. And as of today, the strait has been effectively closed for over 6 weeks, and despite the ceasefire on April 8th, ship traffic remains far below pre-war levels. Ali Akbar Velayati, a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader, said that the key to the Strait of Hormuz remains in Iran's hands. 3 supertankers made the journey through the strait on one recent Saturday. Pre-war traffic was over 100 vessels per day. 3 is not recovery, 3 is a trickle. Gasoline is at $4.12 and diesel is at $5.62, and the worst has not arrived yet. The national average price of gasoline has risen to $4.12 per gallon as of this week, according to AAA. That is up 38% since the conflict began. Diesel has reached $5.62 per gallon, up 49%. And those numbers are national averages, which means coastal markets, rural areas with limited refinery access, and states with higher fuel taxes are already well above those averages. Patrick DeHaan, GasBuddy's head of petroleum analysis, warned that a $4 per gallon national average breaches a psychological wall for American consumers. And supply chain professor Patrick Penfield at Syracuse University warned that if a peace agreement is not reached within the month, a move toward $5 per gallon by mid-May is a distinct possibility. Phil Flynn, senior market analyst at Price Futures Group, told Fox Business that there is more to come because there is usually a lag between crude prices and what consumers pay at the pump. That lag is critical. The gasoline you bought this week was refined from crude that was purchased weeks ago at a lower price. The crude that was purchased at $115 per barrel in early April has not yet been refined, shipped, and delivered to your local gas station. When it arrives, the price at the pump will reflect the $115 barrel, not the $70 barrel that the last batch was made from. And diesel prices matter even more than gasoline for the overall economy because diesel powers the entire supply chain. Every semi-truck on every interstate, every piece of farm equipment in every field, every freight train, every cargo ship docking at an American port. When diesel hits $5.62 per gallon, every shipping cost in America rises, and every shipping cost is passed to the consumer. GasBuddy's DeHaan warned that consumers could see the impact by April through higher prices at the supermarket and for their online orders. Jeremy Siegel, senior economist at WisdomTree, wrote that gasoline is __, quote _5 __, and the Trump administration, which had been campaigning on affordability ahead of the midterm elections, now faces the reality that the war has exacerbated an already struggling economy. Trump himself told Fox News on Sunday that gas prices __, quote _6 _ by the midterms. When the president tells you prices might be higher by November, you are not looking at a temporary spike. You are looking at a structural repricing that will persist through the election and into 2027. The food price shock is coming behind the fuel price shock, and it will hit harder. The Strait of Hormuz is not just an oil choke point, it is central to the global fertilizer trade. Over 30% of the world's urea, which is the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer and is produced from natural gas, is exported from Gulf countries through the strait. When the strait closed, it did not just cut off oil. It cut off the raw materials that feed the agricultural systems that feed the world. The British think tank, the Food Policy Institute, has warned of long-term increases in food prices due to disruption in both fuel and fertilizer markets. As of April 2026, there are ongoing concerns about both energy security and food security related to fertilizer shortages and costs. This is the chain reaction that most Americans do not understand. The strait closes. Oil prices surge, diesel prices surge, fertilizer exports stop. Farmers who need to apply spring fertilizer face either shortages or prices that have doubled. The fertilizer cost gets embedded in the crop price. The crop price gets embedded in the food processing cost. The processing cost gets embedded in the wholesale price. The wholesale price gets embedded in the retail price. And 6 to 8 weeks after the fertilizer disruption, grocery prices begin to climb in a way that does not reverse when oil prices come back down because the fertilizer was either not applied or applied at a higher cost, and the crop yield reflects that for the entire growing season. ABC News reported that rising energy prices have already complicated the inflation outlook. The Consumer Price Index was at 2.4% in January before the war. The oil shock is expected to add 0.8% or more to global inflation, according to analysts. The Dallas Federal Reserve published a formal scenario analysis of the impact of the Iran war on U.S. inflation. Their models show that a complete Strait of Hormuz closure lasting 1 quarter adds significantly to core PCE inflation, and a closure lasting 2 or 3 quarters produces inflationary effects that persist well into 2027, even after the strait reopens. The Fed was expected to cut interest rates in 2026. Those cuts are now being postponed or potentially reversed. Higher energy costs feeding into inflation force the Fed to maintain restrictive rates longer, which means mortgage rates stay elevated, credit card rates stay at record highs, and the economy slows without the monetary easing that was supposed to arrive this year. The oil shock hits your gas tank first. The diesel shock hits your grocery bill next. The fertilizer shock hits the fall harvest. The inflation shock hits the Fed's rate decision, and the rate decision hits your mortgage, your car payment, and every loan you carry. The cascade takes 6 to 12 months to fully unfold, and we are 6 weeks into a crisis that the head of the IEA said is larger than 2 1970s oil shocks combined. The worst has not arrived yet. It is still propagating through the system, and what makes the fertilizer disruption particularly dangerous for the American food supply is the timing. Spring planting season in the Midwest and Great Plains runs from April through June. Farmers make their fertilizer purchasing decisions in February and March for spring application. The war began on February 28th. The strait closed on March 4th. The global fertilizer supply chain was disrupted at the exact moment when American farmers were making their most critical input decisions of the year. Farmers who could not secure urea at an affordable price in March face a binary choice. They either pay the elevated price and absorb the cost, which means their break-even price for corn or soybeans rises by 15 to 30%. Or they reduce application rates, which means lower yields per acre, which means less total production, which means higher commodity prices in the fall when the harvest comes in smaller than expected. Either path leads to higher food prices for American consumers by September or October. And that price increase is baked in before the first ear of corn is harvested because the fertilizer decision has already been made or not made. There is no catch-up mechanism. There is no emergency fertilizer reserve equivalent to the SPR. The supply chain is global, the disruption is structural, and the lag is months long. By the time Americans see the food price increase at the grocery store, the cause will have been 6 months in the past and impossible to reverse. This is already the largest energy supply disruption in recorded history, and the ceasefire did not fix it. The IEA characterized the Strait of Hormuz closure as the ___7__. The Dallas Federal Reserve described it as between 2 and 3 times as large as the largest previous geopolitical oil supply disruptions in 1973 and 1990. And the Rapidan Energy consulting firm called it the largest oil supply disruption in history. 3 independent assessments, same conclusion. This is unprecedented, and the ceasefire announced on April 8th between the United States and Iran did not solve the underlying problem. Brent crude, which peaked at $118 per barrel in late March, has only retreated to approximately $97. Not to $70 where it was before the war, not to $80, to $97. The market is telling you that the ceasefire has not restored confidence that the strait will reopen to normal traffic levels. And as of 3 days ago, the U.S. Navy enacted a full blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz after peace negotiations in Pakistan failed. Trump ordered the blockade on Sunday after Vice President Vance said Iran would not provide an ____8__ to abandon its nuclear weapons program. The blockade is being enforced ____9__. Trump threatened to destroy any Iranian military ship that approaches the blockade. And Iran's senior advisor to the supreme leader responded by saying that the key to the Strait of Hormuz remains in Iran's hands. This is not de-escalation. This is escalation layered on top of a ceasefire that was already failing to restore oil flows. The blockade means that the small trickle of tanker traffic that had resumed since the ceasefire may be further disrupted. And the longer the strait remains effectively closed, the more the global strategic reserve buffer shrinks, the more Gulf production infrastructure degrades, and the more permanent the production loss becomes. Here is the math nobody on television is explaining clearly. Before the war, the U.S. SPR held approximately 403 million barrels. The 172 million barrel release reduces it to approximately 231 million barrels, the lowest level in the history of the reserve. Lower than during Desert Storm, lower than during Hurricane Katrina, lower than during the 2022 Ukraine release. The 400 million barrel coordinated IEA release draws down reserves of all 32 member nations simultaneously. Global IEA reserves stood at approximately 1.8 billion barrels before the war. After the release, approximately 1.4 billion remain. Global consumption is 100 million barrels per day. The remaining buffer covers 14 days. The IEA head explicitly warned that the reserve release is not a cure. The cure is opening the strait, and the strait is not open. And the U.S. Navy just enacted a blockade that may further restrict the trickle of traffic that had resumed. The IEA warned that some fields may require specialized oil field services, including workovers, coiled tubing units, chemical treatments, and perforation to restart. Fields relying on enhanced oil recovery could face even longer restart times because they depend on uninterrupted supplies of gas, power, steam, and chemicals that no longer exist in the conflict zone. The damage is not just economic, it is geological. Every day that a well sits shut in without proper maintenance is a day that reservoir pressure changes, flow impairment from wax or asphaltene deposition worsens, and the future productive capacity of that well diminishes. The IEA itself warned that some lost pre-war production may not return. The oil that was underground before February 28th is still underground, but getting it out may now be significantly harder, more expensive, or in some cases impossible without infrastructure that no longer exists. What you can do right now, because the next 90 days will define your household's financial position for the next 2 years. Here is the framework for what you do right now while the cascade is still propagating and before the full impact arrives in grocery prices, utility bills, and interest rate decisions. First, fill your vehicle's tank before Thursday every week. Historically, gas prices tend to be lowest early in the week and highest around weekends, especially during supply-constrained periods. Every fill-up you complete at $4.12 is a fill-up you did not complete at $4.50 or $5. That sounds trivial until you multiply it by 52 weeks. Second, stock your pantry now with shelf-stable food. The fertilizer disruption from the strait closure will take 6 to 8 weeks to show up in grocery prices. You are in the window right now where food prices have not yet fully reflected the input cost increase. Every dollar of groceries you buy today at current prices is a dollar of food security that will cost you 15 to 20% more in 2 months. Third, if you heat your home with oil, call your supplier today and lock in a delivery price for next winter. Oil delivery contracts purchased in spring and summer are almost always cheaper than contracts purchased in October. And in a year where global oil supply is structurally disrupted, that price gap will be larger than normal. Fourth, reduce every discretionary trip you take in a vehicle until the situation stabilizes. Combine errands. Carpool with neighbors. Work from home every day your employer permits it. Every gallon you save in April is a gallon of flexibility you have if prices reach $5 by May. Fifth, pay down variable rate debt as aggressively as you can because the inflation caused by this oil shock may delay or reverse the Fed's rate-cutting path. If the Fed holds rates steady or raises them in response to energy-driven inflation, your credit card APR, your HELOC rate, and every variable rate obligation you carry will cost more for longer. Sixth, look at your investment portfolio and assess your exposure to sectors that benefit from high oil prices versus sectors that are damaged by them. Energy companies, pipeline operators, and oil field services firms are the beneficiaries of this crisis. Airlines, trucking companies, retailers, and consumer discretionary companies are the casualties. Your retirement savings should not be concentrated on the losing side of an oil shock that the IEA has called the largest in history. I want to close by saying something that no one on cable news will tell you because it is politically inconvenient for every party and every administration. The United States of America, the most powerful economy on earth, the country that produces more oil than any other nation, the country that claims energy independence, is currently watching its citizens pay $4.12 for gasoline and $5.62 for diesel because a waterway 7,000 miles away was closed by a country with a GDP smaller than that of the state of Ohio. That is the reality of American energy security in 2026. We produce more oil than we have ever produced in our history, and we cannot protect our own citizens from a price shock caused by the closure of a strait that we do not control in a war that we started with strategic reserves that we drained for budget offsets and political convenience over the past decade. The 1973 oil embargo taught America that dependence on foreign oil is a strategic vulnerability. In response, we created the SPR. We invested in domestic production, we funded alternative energy research, and then we forgot the lesson. We drained the SPR. We let refining capacity stagnate. We let the infrastructure age. We let the strategic buffer shrink. And we started a war in the one region of the world whose stability determines the price of every barrel of oil that keeps the global economy functioning. And now we are watching the consequences unfold in real time at every gas pump, every grocery store, every diesel station, and every utility bill in the country. No American is ready for what is coming because no American was told the truth about how fragile the system actually was. Until now. Share this video with every American you know who drives a vehicle, heats a home, or feeds a family because the information in this video is the difference between a household that prepared and a household that discovered the crisis from the price tag at the gas station. Subscribe and turn on notifications. I will be tracking every oil price movement, every IEA strategic release, every Strait of Hormuz development, every SPR drawdown, and every inflation report in real time. No spin, no party line, just the truth about what the Iran oil shock means for your money and your family. Take care of yourselves out there. Clarity is the most valuable thing you can give someone right now, and I will see you in the next one. And remember, the last time a president faced an oil shock of this magnitude heading into an election, it was Jimmy Carter in 1979. Inflation hit 14.8%. The Federal Reserve raised rates to 20%. Carter lost in a landslide. The economic damage from that shock took 4 years to unwind and reshaped American politics for a generation. The current shock is, by the IEA's own assessment, larger, and the tools available to respond to it are weaker because the SPR was drained, the refining capacity was never expanded, and the strategic buffer that previous generations built was spent. The decisions you make in the next 90 days will define your household's financial position for the next 2 years. Make them now while you still have the window to act, because that window is closing faster than any window I have described on this channel, and once it closes, the price of inaction becomes permanent.